When the sun sets over the dusty plains and shadows grow long, a single choice can change the course of fate. Welcome, dear listeners, to a tale of survival and secrets in the unforgiving American frontier. Tonight we meet a poor widow with a haunted past and the sheriff she dares to save. As you're pulled into these wind-swept prairies, get ready for gun smoke, whispered confessions, and a startling revelation that threatens to unravel everything. Tension simmers in every clap of thunder, and you won't believe what is lurking beneath a seemingly humble roof. Buckle up, friends. The West is about to get wild. The year was 1882, and a fierce wind whipped across the arid plains of southeastern Arizona. The sun sat low in the sky, painting the rugged landscape in a palette of burnt orange and coppery red. Heat shimmered in undulating waves, warping the horizon. Cactus arms reached toward the heavens, silently witnessing the unrelenting drama of the frontier. In the distance, the silhouette of a solitary figure horse, stumbling beneath him, struggled through the parched wilderness. That figure was Sheriff Thaddeus Mulligan, a lawman known across these parts for his stubborn dedication to justice and an unflinching moral code. But on this scorching afternoon, justice was the last thing on his mind. Each breath threatened to cut him short. A bullet had grazed his side in a skirmish with a group of bandits outside the old mining camp near the Dragoon Mountains. The blood loss was steady, sapping his strength. Each mile felt longer than the last, and his horse was as desperate as he was for water and shelter. Sheriff Mulligan cast a glance around in despair. He had no illusions about survival if he failed to find refuge before sundown. The blazing desert heat and vultures circling overhead were enough to discourage even the bravest soul. Yet he pressed on, coaxing his trembling horse forward in search of any sign of a homestead. If there was a living soul out here with a kind heart, he might just see another day. Then, miraculously, he saw it. A small, weather-beaten shack with a sagging porch perched on a slight rise. Light glimmered in one of the windows. Someone was home. Summoning the last of his energy, the sheriff directed his horse toward the promise of salvation, uncertain of what awaited him, but fully aware that this was his only chance. The widow Harriet O'Connell sat on that very porch, her calloused hands busy cleaning a small rifle she kept for protection. At first glance, Harriet appeared as many frontier women did, skin-deeply tanned hair pinned in a loose bun, and a determined gaze set into her eyes. Hardship had etched lines across her brow that only her 30 years of life could not fully explain. It was her soul's burden that weighed on her, and her isolation in this remote patch of land magnified that burden daily. 2 years prior, Harriet's husband, Jonas O'Connell, had passed away under mysterious circumstances. What was recorded on the county register simply read, "Deceased due to a ranching accident." Yet local gossip insinuated a darker story, whispered behind church pews and over whiskey in the saloons of Wilcox. Some claimed Jonas had gotten tangled up with outlaws, while others believed he was involved in unscrupulous deals with unscrupulous men. The truth was something Harriet seldom spoke of, if at all. Jonas had left Harriet with nothing but crippling debt and a small plot of land far from the railroad lines. She had tried her best to keep the livestock, but a prolonged drought and repeated raids by wandering thieves had forced her to sell most of her animals just to pay off some of Jonas's lingering obligations. Now she eked out a humble living, growing a few vegetables and doing sewing work for a distant general store that occasionally sent wagons through. And always she kept a watchful eye on the horizon, her heart heavy with secrets she never dared share. When Harriet saw a lone horse carrying a slumped figure, her breath caught in her throat. Out here, uninvited visitors could be a blessing or a curse. Drawing the rifle to her shoulder, Harriet stared down the approaching stranger. From the battered cowboy hat and trailing blood that stained his torn shirt, she guessed he was a man in dire need of help. The lawman's tin star caught the last of the sunlight, flashing like a desperate signal. A sheriff, Harriet thought, or at least someone claiming to be. Uncertain but guided by the moral compass her mother had instilled in her, she stepped off the porch. Sheriff Mulligan nearly collapsed when Harriet reached him. Sliding off the horse, he clutched his side, the wound a deep crimson against the dusty fabric of his shirt. Harriet's first instinct was to point. Her rifle trust was a rare commodity here, but something in his eyes, a mixture of pain and unyielding grit, spoke to her. Setting aside her weapon, she took him by the arm and led him into her modest home, her heart pounding. He introduced himself in a strained whisper. "Sheriff Thaddeus Mulligan, ma'am." Then explained how bandits had ambushed him. Harriet knew well enough that bandits roamed these parts. The territory was rife with outlaws ever since the Earp brothers had chased out some gangs a few years back in Tombstone. The outlaws simply migrated, scattering like cockroaches to other lonely stretches of land. In the cramped front room that served as both living area and kitchen, Harriet eased the wounded sheriff onto an old cot. On the walls hung only a few relics of Jonas's existence, a faded wedding photograph and a tarnished pocket watch that Harriet had yet to sell. The shutters creaked in the wind, letting in strands of dust that caught the afternoon light in golden streams. Harriet hurried to gather her meager supplies: clean rags, a chipped bowl of water, and an herbal salve she'd made from desert plants. Her knowledge of medicine was limited, gleaned out of sheer necessity from witnessing the injuries Jonas had brought home during his shady dealings. With swift, gentle hands, she removed the sheriff's shirt, pressing fresh rags to the wound to stem the bleeding. He winced, but remained stoic. Harriet offered the sheriff a small sip of whiskey to dull the pain. They locked eyes for a moment, his gave silent gratitude. Hers carried weary concern. She set to work, cleaning and bandaging the wound. Outside, the hot wind continued to blow, rustling the roof in ominous moans. Harriet could not shake a nagging dread. Maybe it was the old fear that one day someone might come asking questions about Jonas. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that harboring a wounded lawman might draw dangerous people to her door. Night fell swiftly. Harriet lit a solitary oil lamp that cast flickering shadows on the walls. She coaxed a small fire in the hearth, using the last remnants of her firewood. Despite the sheriff's protests that he didn't want to be any trouble, she insisted he stay. A quiet tension settled between them. Harriet was guarded, and Thaddeus, though grateful, sensed her apprehension. He had heard rumors around these parts about a widow who lived alone, a woman rumored to have been entangled in her husband's questionable dealings. But Harriet didn't fit the outlaw mold. She seemed kind and reticent, though haunted by something she kept locked away. Over a modest supper of beans and bread, Harriet finally asked how he'd ended up alone in such a dangerous stretch. Thaddeus explained that he'd been following a tip about the whereabouts of the Laredo Gang, a ruthless group known for robbing stagecoaches and leaving no witnesses. Their leader, Royce Crandall, was rumored to be in league with a more influential network of criminals that extended across the territory, possibly even connecting to the infamous Cochise County Cowboys, or men allied with the late Curly Bill. Though Harriet said little, her silence spoke volumes. She listened intently, eyes darting occasionally to a battered trunk in the corner. If Thaddeus noticed, he didn't ask. But every time he mentioned the possibility of local outlaws, Harriet's face paled slightly, and she would busy herself stirring her coffee or tidying up scraps. After dinner, Harriet set a blanket for herself on the wooden floor. Thaddeus insisted he could sleep on the floor. But Harriet, her voice steeled by hardship, refused to let a wounded man go without a proper bed. Their arrangement might have been awkward under normal circumstances, but out here in the desert, survival overshadowed decorum. Neither slept well. Harriet awoke often to check the sheriff's bandage, and Thaddeus's dreams were haunted by the image of hooded figures on horseback, brandishing rifles. Several times in the night he startled awake, hand moving toward the holster that Harriet had placed out of reach for his own good. Outside, coyotes howled, the ghostly sound lingering in the night air like a portent of trouble. The next morning, as dawn broke across the plains in swathes of dusty pink and pale gold, Harriet gingerly changed Thaddeus's bandages. The wound looked somewhat better. No sign of infection, which was a small miracle in these conditions. Still, rest was imperative, and Harriet told him plainly that he was in no shape to ride. Thaddeus's eyes flicked to the window, scanning the horizon. "If there's a posse after the Laredo gang, they might come this way," he said, voice taut. Harriet gave a short nod, though she didn't seem enthusiastic about the idea of a posse arriving. That was when he noticed her gaze linger on an old family Bible near the trunk. The name O'Connell was embossed in gold leaf on the cover. Eager to shift the focus, Harriet offered him a cup of coffee and a stale biscuit. Thaddeus, his appetite weak, sipped the lukewarm brew. His thoughts wandered to the bullet that nearly killed him, the outlaws who had shot it, and his sheer luck in stumbling upon Harriet's cabin. He studied her face. There was a beauty there, masked by hardship and fear. Midway through the meager breakfast, they heard the distant rumble of hooves. Harriet stiffened quickly, setting her cup down and grabbing her rifle. Thaddeus forced himself upright, ignoring the searing hole in his side. Carefully, Harriet peered through a small gap in the shutters. A group of riders were approaching from the south dust, trailing behind them in a devilish haze. There were 4 of them, and from what Harriet could see, they didn't look like any sheriff's deputies. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "Could be the Laredo gang," he whispered, voice hushed and urgent. Harriet nodded, pulse quickening. She hid behind the doorframe, heart pounding like thunder. If these men were indeed part of the gang that shot Thaddeus, they might be looking for him. Or worse, they might know something about Jonas O'Connell that Harriet had kept hidden since the day of his death. The riders pulled up in a swirl of dust. One dismounted a wiry man with a ragged beard and eyes as cold as flint. Harriet noticed the emblem of a coiled snake embroidered on his vest. She'd heard rumors that this was a sign used by Crandall's men. Another man, broad-shouldered with a scar running down the left side of his face, surveyed the cabin with menacing curiosity. They approached the porch as Harriet and Thaddeus crouched out of sight. "Anyone home?" the bearded man called, voice dripping with hostility. He glanced at the cabin's single window, noting the lamplight inside and the fresh hoof prints in the yard. "I can see signs of life. So come on out." Inside, Harriet's breath caught in her throat. She and Thaddeus exchanged a tense look. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. What if Jonas's hidden ledgers were still in the trunk? What if these men were the ones Jonas had been in cahoots with? What if they discovered the wounded sheriff inside? Harriet whispered, "We can't let them in." But Thaddeus, in a whisper just as urgent, said, "They'll break down the door if we don't show ourselves. Maybe I can bluff them, tell them I passed through but kept riding." Harriet considered the plan. It was dangerous, but so was remaining silent. Mustering her courage, she cracked the door open just enough to step onto the porch. Standing there in her faded dress rifle, clutched in both hands, Harriet tried to appear calm. Mornin she greeted them stiffly, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. The bearded man took a step forward, ignoring Harriet's attempt at distance. "We're looking for a law dog. Name's Mulligan. Heard he might be in the area." The mention of Thaddeus's name confirmed her worst fear. They were indeed searching for him. Keeping the rifle pointed low but ready, Harriet answered, "Nobody's come through here for weeks. I'm alone." She steadied her voice. "You can look around if you like." It was a bold gambit, but Harriet was counting on Thaddeus finding a place to hide. She also counted on these men not being thorough or suspicious enough to rummage her entire cabin. The broad-shouldered man with the scar parted his lips in a grin that revealed broken teeth. "We might just do that," he replied, taking another step. Anxiety churned in Harriet's stomach. One wrong move, and bullets could fly. The gang members fanned out around the small homestead. 2 men checked the stable out back, while the bearded man and the scarred man stepped into the cabin's main room. Harriet followed, rifle still in hand, pulse hammering in her ears. She feared that if they discovered Thaddeus, a shootout would be inevitable, and in his condition, that was a death sentence. Inside, the men's boots stomped over the wooden floor. They poked at Harriet's paltry furnishings, knocked on the walls to see if anything was hidden, and rummaged through the single closet. Harriet tried to remain aloof, leaning against the doorframe as though she had nothing to hide. She prayed Thaddeus had found a good hiding place. One of the men took an interest in the old trunk near the Bible. He unlatched it and started pawing through Harriet's late husband's belongings. Harriet bit her lip, terrified they might find the papers Jonas had stashed at the bottom, papers that hinted at hush money deals and blackmail. Harriet had no idea how incriminating they might be, or if Jonas's old associates were even aware of their existence. Across the room, the scarred man glanced at Harriet. "Mighty poor place you got here," he sneered. "How'd your fella die, freak accident?" Harriet lied, her eyes betraying no emotion. "He took a fall while out hunting cougars." The bearded man barked out a harsh laugh. Hunting cougars? Jonas O'Connell was known for hunting bigger game than that. He locked eyes with Harriet, waiting to see if she would flinch at his insinuation. She did not. At that moment, one of the other outlaws returned from the stable, announcing that nothing of interest was out, back just a half-rotted wagon and no horse. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Harriet silently begged them to leave. Eventually, the men seemed satisfied that the sheriff was not hiding in plain sight. They noticed the meager plates on the table, but Harriet brushed off their questions, saying she was in the middle of her morning chores. With a final chilling stare, the bearded man signaled for his companions to step outside. Before leaving, he turned to Harriet. "If Mulligan shows up around here, you'd best let us know he threatened spitting a wad of tobacco juice on the floor. We pay better than the law." Harriet said nothing, her heart pounding in her chest as the 4 outlaws mounted their horses and rode off, leaving only swirling dust in their wake. When they were gone, Harriet rushed to the corner where the trunk had been pushed aside. Carefully, she opened the lid. To her immense relief, the small bundle of old ledgers and letters was still concealed beneath false bottom boards Jonas had installed long ago. She had no idea what incriminating evidence lay within them, but she was certain her husband's dealings had been less than honorable. She set the trunk upright and then began searching for Thaddeus. "Sheriff," she whispered. In answer, A panel in the floor near the hearth shifted, and he emerged, wincing at the effort. Harriet helped him stand, noticing fresh beads of sweat on his brow from the tension and pain. "My apologies," he muttered. "I didn't see a better hiding place than under the floor." "Thank you for your quick thinking." Harriet forced a tight smile. "They might come back, and next time they might not take my word so easily." Her voice trembled, betraying the fear she'd tried so hard to suppress. Thaddeus frowned, gaze drifting to the trunk. Harriet noticed, but said nothing. She had grown adept at secrecy, at burying truths that might endanger her. Still, part of her wanted to confide in him, tell him about Jonas and the money that vanished after his death, or how she sometimes suspected her husband had never died in any accident at all. But the words caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to trust a lawman, no matter how kindly he seemed. Nevertheless, Harriet and Thaddeus recognized they were bound together now by circumstance. As Harriet handed him a fresh bandage, she decided for the moment to put the matter of Jonas aside. The immediate threat was those outlaws, and Harriet needed Thaddeus fit enough to help defend the homestead if they returned. Over the next few days, Harriet nursed Thaddeus diligently. His fever broke on the third night, and he began to regain enough strength to shuffle around the cabin with Harriet's assistance. In these close quarters, they developed a cautious friendship. Harriet discovered that Thaddeus's parents were Irish immigrants who had come west seeking fortune, but found only dust and heartbreak. After their passing, Thaddeus had bounced from ranch to ranch before enlisting as a deputy. He eventually earned a reputation as a fair but relentless lawman, which got him elected as sheriff in a small county near the border. In turn, Harriet shared a few of her own tales from when she was a girl in Kansas, traveling by wagon train with her mother. She spoke little of Jonas, only offering that he died suddenly and left her with a mountain of debt. She confessed that she tried to sell the land, but found no buyers willing to set up home so far from civilization. Thaddeus tried to encourage her, telling her she showed admirable grit, but Harriet simply offered a weary shrug. One evening, as a fiery sunset turned the sky to ribbons of pink and orange, Thaddeus stood on the porch leaning on the railing. Harriet joined him, heart heavy. The memory of those men ransacking her home lingered, and she worried that they might return. A quiet hush settled over the desert, broken only by the distant wail of a coyote. "Thank you," Thaddeus said softly, turning to her. "You could have turned me in. You could have told them I was here." Harriet avoided his gaze. "I don't have it in me to leave a wounded man, to die." She paused, fiddling with a loose splinter on the porch rail. "But I wonder if it was the smart thing to do for my own sake." Thaddeus exhaled, a shadow crossing his face. "I'm sorry for the trouble." He shifted, trying to hide the pain still throbbing in his side. "Once I'm well, I'll be on my way, so you can have some peace." Harriet's lips parted as if to protest, but she said nothing. She was torn. Part of her wanted the sheriff gone, worried that his presence invited danger. Yet another part of her felt a strange comfort in his company. She had been alone for so long. Too long. That night, while Thaddeus slept fitfully, Harriet finally dared to open the trunk alone. She needed to know if her husband's secret might threaten them further. The oil lamp's flame danced as she lifted the false bottom and retrieved a stack of papers. Her hands trembled. Most were accounting ledgers with cryptic entries. Letters of interest receipts for massive sums and references to individuals Harriet had never heard of. She recognized the name Royce Crandall repeated several times often, accompanied by sums of money that left her breathless. Jonas was dealing with Crandall, the very man Thaddeus was after. Worse yet, letters hinted at blackmail, as if Jonas had discovered something about Crandall's bigger network men in Tombstone, or perhaps even in the newly developing town of Phoenix. Harriet skimmed line after line, her heart pounding with every mention of secret deals or hush payments. One letter in particular stood out. It bore the signature R. Crandall and read, "Jonas, keep the ledger safe. If you breathe a word of our agreement to anyone, you'll be feeding the vultures by sundown. Our next job is set for the 12th near Ironwood Creek. Don't forget your part, and don't think we won't be watching. R.C." The date mentioned in the letter was exactly 1 week before Jonas's so-called accident. Harriet's stomach knotted. Everything pointed to Jonas's death being no mere mishap. Possibly he had threatened to betray Crandall, or maybe Crandall double-crossed him. Either way, Harriet realized that if the gang learned these documents still existed, they would undoubtedly return to claim them and kill anyone who stood in their way. Sick with dread, Harriet carefully replaced the papers and secured the trunk. She doused the lamp, hoping against hope that Thaddeus would be healed enough to leave soon, and that she could finally put the nightmares of Jonas's life behind her. Morning dawned. Thaddeus, finding his strength somewhat improved, offered to chop firewood to repay Harriet's kindness. It was a simple gesture, but Harriet accepted. As he split logs behind the cabin, Harriet's thoughts lingered on the damning evidence in the trunk. She resolved not to speak of it. Why draw the law's attention if it could endanger her? But fate had other plans. While taking a break to catch his breath, Thaddeus noticed the trunk was ajar. Harriet, in her exhaustion, had neglected to slide the latch fully back into place. Curiosity tugged at him. He recalled the men's interest in it, and he also recalled Harriet's anxious glances whenever the trunk was mentioned. With a lawman's instinct, he knelt down and lifted the lid. It took only a moment to discover the false bottom and the evidence. Thaddeus's eyes widened as he realized the significance of the ledgers. He recognized the names, especially Royce Crandall. If Harriet's husband had been in league with Crandall, and these documents were genuine, they could blow wide open the criminal network that had plagued several territories. This was bigger than a single gang. Suddenly, Harriet's voice cut through the hush. "What are you doing?" She stood in the doorway, face flushed with alarm. She placed a trembling hand on the trunk lid, shutting it firmly. Thaddeus rose, a wave of guilt flooding him. "I'm sorry." He searched for the right words. "I had to see." Her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and anger. "Yes, well, now you've seen. Jonas was mixed up in bad business, and it likely got him killed. Those men you're after, they're the same ones who came looking for you. You understand now why I'm wary of your presence here." Thaddeus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, despite the tension. "Harriet, these papers could change everything. If Jonas had these ledgers, he was either blackmailing Crandall or planning to turn him in." She nodded, resigned. "And look where that got him." Thaddeus stepped back, his expression conflicted. "If we can get these documents to my deputy or the territorial judge, we can bring Crandall's entire operation down. It could free you from ever worrying about them again." Harriet's voice wavered. "Or it could get us both killed." A restless hush followed. Harriet recognized the gravity of the situation. Thaddeus's sense of duty meant he wouldn't simply ride off and ignore the evidence. But Harriet feared retaliation from Crandall if word got out that Jonas's widow held incriminating documents. They talked late into the night. Harriet explained that after Jonas died, Men had come knocking, claiming Jonas owed them money. She had paid all she could, but their demands only escalated. Then abruptly they stopped. No one came around for nearly a year until now. Thaddeus theorized that maybe Crandall had assumed the documents were lost or destroyed. With Thaddeus re-entering the picture, combined with rumors about Harriet, the gang had reason to suspect the documents might still exist. Thaddeus proposed a plan. Once he was able to ride, they would take the documents to the county seat at Wilcox and place them in the hands of his deputy, Martin Delgado, a trustworthy man who had worked with the Pinkertons in the past. If Delgado and a judge got wind of the evidence, formal warrants could be issued. They'd gather a larger posse and take down Crandall. Harriet was reluctant. "You don't understand how dangerous Crandall is," she said. "He has allies across the territory. We might make it halfway to Wilcox, only to be ambushed on the road." Thaddeus gave a sober nod. "I know the odds are steep, but if Crandall remains free, you'll never have peace, and neither will I." After a heavy silence, Harriet finally conceded. "We'll do it then. But we must be careful." 2 days later, Thaddeus tested his strength by saddling Harriet's old horse, Patch, which she had nearly sold, but decided to keep for emergency runs to Wilcox. The ride would take them half a day under normal circumstances, longer with Thaddeus still convalescing and the possibility of being followed. Harriet's nerves were raw, and she made sure to hide the documents in a discreet satchel under the horse's saddle blanket. Just before dawn, Harriet doused the lamps, locked the cabin door, and donned her husband's old hat to shield herself from the scorching sun. In the distance, a coyote yipped as though signaling their departure. Thaddeus and Harriet exchanged a final look, each grappling with uncertainty. Then, with a gentle nudge to Patch, they set off across the desert plains. The early morning light cast long shadows behind them, but Harriet's anxiety remained. She kept the rifle across her lap as they rode. She thought of Jonas, of the day she found him lying face down near a ridge, a bullet in his back. It was a sight she tried to forget, but it haunted her still. Could their journey now lead to a similar fate for her, or the sheriff? By late morning, they approached a shallow ravine. Thaddeus slowed the horse, scanning the rocky outcrops. "We should be cautious here," he whispered, voice tense. Harriet nodded, clutching the rifle. The ravine was notorious for ambushes. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off a nearby boulder, sending shards of rock into the air. Patch reared, nearly throwing Harriet. 3 riders emerged from behind large rocks, the bearded outlaw, the scarred man, and 2 additional figures armed with rifles. They had been waiting. Harriet's blood turned to ice. She steadied the rifle, returning fire with a burst of adrenaline she never knew she possessed. Thaddeus slid off the horse, taking cover behind a boulder. Another volley of shots crackled through the desert air. Bullets whizzed past Harriet's head, and the dust around them churned into a suffocating haze. Thaddeus clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the pain in his side as he fired at one of the outlaws perched above the ravine. He managed to clip the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling behind cover. Harriet lined up another shot and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet struck near the bearded man, forcing him to duck. The scarred man hollered, "We know you got the papers. Hand 'em over, and maybe we'll let you live." His voice echoed off the rocks. Thaddeus yelled back, "Come and take 'em!" The lawman's challenge crackled with defiance, though Harriet could hear the strain in his voice. A tense standoff followed. Thaddeus and Harriet crouched behind the boulder, reloading. The bearded man and scarred man motioned for the others to flank around. Harriet's heart pounded with dread. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Suddenly, Harriet spotted a narrow path leading up the ravine behind them. "Sheriff, if we can reach that path, we might climb out of this death trap," she shouted over the gunfire. Thaddeus nodded, timing it between shots. Harriet darted to Patch, who was stamping nervously. She grabbed the reins and tugged the horse toward the path. Thaddeus provided covering fire, each shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. Harriet's quick thinking caught the outlaws off guard, buying them a precious few seconds. They scrambled up the narrow trail hooves, scraping on loose shale. The scarred man cursed and fired after them bullets, pinging off rocks dangerously close. Harriet fired back blindly, teeth gritted. By sheer luck, they emerged at the top of the ravine, gulping air and urging Patch to gallop forward. Freed from the ravine, they raced across open desert. The outlaws were in pursuit, though, at a slight distance. Harriet urged Patch to keep going, scanning the horizon for any sign of a settlement. Even a small ranch or way station might offer some cover. Thaddeus pressed a hand against his bandaged side, fresh blood seeping through. His face twisted in pain, yet he remained upright, determined. Harriet glanced at him, worry etched in her eyes, but she spurred Patch onward. As the sun climbed overhead, the heat became punishing. Their canteens were half empty, and the outlaws' hoots echoed in the distance. Harriet prayed that Thaddeus's deputy or any local rancher might be patrolling near the main road. After what felt like an eternity, they sighted the outskirts of Wilcox, a modest cluster of wooden buildings, a church steeple, and a dusty main street. The outlaws had not given up, though their silhouettes visible against the shimmering horizon. Harriet and Thaddeus clung to hope that once in town the presence of the law and armed citizens would discourage an open gunfight. They tore into Wilcox, startling a few townsfolk. A blacksmith paused hammer aloft, and an old woman holding a basket of laundry gasped. Harriet spotted the small sheriff's office near the general store, a chipped sign reading Thaddeus Mulligan, Sheriff, above the door. She guided Patch there, her heart hammering like a locomotive. They dismounted hurriedly. Harriet half-supported, half-dragged Thaddeus inside. Deputy Martin Delgado, a tall man with a meticulous handlebar mustache, sprang to his feet, shock and relief etched into his features. "Sheriff, what in blazes?" "No time." Thaddeus gasped, collapsing into a chair. "Outlaws. Crandall's men. They're coming." Delgado nodded grimly. He grabbed a lever-action rifle from a rack on the wall and stepped onto the porch. Harriet followed, rifle clutched tight. Townsfolk scattered, sensing trouble. The deputy signaled to a few local men who served as volunteer deputies. They armed themselves and took defensive positions around the main street. Moments later, the outlaws thundered into sight. Leading them were the bearded man and the scarred man, each brandishing a rifle. They paused at the outskirts of town, uncertain whether to charge in. Delgado shouted, "Drop your weapons. This is Wilcox, and you are outnumbered." A tense standoff ensued. The outlaws looked from side to side, gauging how many townspeople stood ready to shoot. Harriet noticed a flash of recognition on the bearded man's face. Perhaps he hadn't expected the entire town to stand against them. "I'll kill you for what you took." The scarred man spat through Harriet, suspected he was bluffing. The sight of armed men behind barricades made him reconsider. He turned his horse with a curse. The others followed suit, retreating under a hail of warning shots that kicked up plumes of dust. Within minutes, they disappeared back into the desert. The danger past, Harriet and Delgado exchanged relieved glances. Still trembling from adrenaline, Harriet ran back inside to check on Thaddeus. Thaddeus was slumped in the chair, sweaty and pale. Harriet helped him drink water. Delgado hovered nearby, concern furrowing his brow. "Sheriff, I feared the worst when you didn't return." "Who are those men?" Thaddeus panted. "Part of the Laredo gang. But it's bigger. We have evidence Jonas O'Connell's ledgers, link to Royce Crandall." He stared at Delgado with urgency. "We must gather a posse. We can't let them roam free." Delgado's eyes widened. "Jonas O'Connell. That name's come up before with suspicious activity. Show me the documents." Harriet retrieved the satchel from under Patch's saddle. Inside, behind the folded blanket, she pulled out Jonas's ledgers and the incriminating letters. Delgado's expression darkened as he flipped through the pages. "This is enough to send the entire gang to Yuma prison," he murmured. "And possibly some bigger fish, too." Thaddeus struggled to stand. "Deputy, I'm counting on you to round up every man you can trust. We're going after Crandall wherever he's holed up. Harriet here has put her life on the line for this." For the first time, Delgado glanced at Harriet. She looked exhausted, her face smeared with dust and sweat. "You've done a brave thing," Delgado said. Harriet didn't feel brave. She felt terrified. Yet she nodded her head in acknowledgement. That afternoon, the deputy sent telegrams to nearby towns calling on any law-abiding citizens or officers to converge in Wilcox. Harriet hovered near Thaddeus's side, determined to see this through. The local doctor, Dr. Emerson, arrived to tend Thaddeus's wound properly. Harriet was thankful for medical supplies that far exceeded her meager stash of herbs and whiskey. News of the incriminating documents spread quickly among the townspeople. Some were outraged that Jonas O'Connell, once rumored to be a mild-mannered rancher, had trafficked with criminals. Others whispered that Harriet must have known all along. Harriet shrank from their judgmental gazes, focusing instead on Thaddeus's recovery and the plan. To bring Crandall to justice. 2 days later, a small but formidable posse had gathered 15 men in total, armed with rifles and sidearms. Among them were a few ex-Union soldiers, a blacksmith with biceps like forged steel, and an old Pinkerton agent named George H. Ward, who'd been trailing Crandall's network for months. Even a visiting rancher from New Mexico territory, Clyde Jacobs, volunteered. He claimed he had once lost a herd of cattle to Crandall's rustlers and wanted revenge. With a map spread across the sheriff's desk, the group discussed strategy. Jonas's ledgers hinted at a hideout near Ironwood Creek, the same place mentioned in the letter Harriet had found. Ward insisted that intelligence suggested Crandall was indeed operating from an abandoned ranch there, using it as a staging point for robberies. Thaddeus, pale but resolute, declared, "We strike at dawn. Surprise is our best weapon." Harriet stood in the back, arms crossed, listening. Despite her fear, she knew she had to see this through to the end. That night, Harriet found Thaddeus alone in the sheriff's office, cleaning his revolver. She stepped inside the hinges, creaking behind her. He looked up, smiling faintly, but she could see the worry in his eyes. She approached quietly. "How's the wound?" "Better," he said, though pain lingered in his voice. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Harriet took a shaky breath. "There's something I need to tell you. About Jonas." Thaddeus set the revolver down, giving her his full attention. Harriet explained how she'd first met Jonas, a charming dreamer who talked of buying land and raising cattle. But shortly after they settled, Jonas changed. He came home late with bruises and black eyes. At times, he showed Harriet large sums of money that disappeared just as quickly. Then came the threats from mysterious men. the hush talk about big deals. Jonas never confided in Harriet, but she suspected he was in deep with criminals. One night, Harriet overheard Jonas talking to Royce Crandall. She realized her husband was involved in blackmail. He had discovered something that could ruin Crandall and was using it to line his own pockets. Harriet confronted Jonas, begging him to turn away from crime, but he insisted it was too late. A week later, Harriet found him dead near a ridge, a bullet in his back. Tears welled up in her eyes. I hated him for what he was doing, but I also loved him. It's a confusing hurt. Thaddeus placed a comforting hand over hers. Harriet, I'm sorry. You've carried this alone for far too long. She bowed her head. I don't want any more bloodshed. But if stopping Crandall means no one else has to suffer, I'll do whatever it takes. The day of the raid arrived. At first light, the posse rode out, dust kicked up by the horses in a determined cloud. Harriet rode alongside Thaddeus, her rifle strapped to the saddle. Fear churned in her gut, but a steely resolve anchored her. The desert air was crisp in the early morning, the sky a pale canvas ready for the sun's first strokes of light. Ironwood Creek was a dry riverbed that meandered through jagged hills dotted with mesquite trees. As they approached, the posse split into two flanks, hoping to surround the old ranch house rumored to be Crandall's hideout. Harriet and Thaddeus stayed with the main group led by Delgado. Creeping closer, they spotted wooden fences in disrepair and a barn door hanging off its hinges. A wisp of smoke curled from the chimney of a small shack near the main house. The posse halted. Delgado signaled for two men to circle around, rifles at the ready. A hush fell over them, interrupted only by the rustle of dry leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Harriet's heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears. Then from the shack, a guard stepped out, yawned, and spat in the dirt. He never saw the men behind him, until it was too late. Delgado's voice rang out. "Drop your weapon! You're surrounded!" Chaos erupted. Shots cracked the still morning air. More men emerged from the main house, rifles blazing. Thaddeus grit his teeth, returning fire alongside Delgado and the others. Harriet found a vantage behind a low stone wall, carefully taking aim at any armed figure. Dust filled the air, swirling in frantic eddies as bullets ricocheted off walls and fences. The posse pressed forward methodically, disarming or incapacitating Crandall's men. Harriet glimpsed the scarred man from the ravine, his rifle muzzle flashing. She steeled herself, squeezed the trigger, and saw him stumble, cursing. Suddenly, a tall, broad-shouldered man burst from the main house, pushing aside one of his own men. His dark eyes blazed, and his face was twisted with fury. Harriet recognized him from a faded wanted poster in Thaddeus's office, Royce Crandall. He raised a heavy shotgun, firing at the posse. One volunteer deputy cried out and collapsed, clutching his leg. Thaddeus advanced, despite the pain that gnawed at him. Crandall surrender. "We have all the evidence we need to hang you," Crandall sneered. "Evidence you think that matters out here? I own half the judges in this territory." He leveled his shotgun at Thaddeus. Time seemed to slow. Harriet was too far away to line up a shot on Crandall without risking hitting Thaddeus. Delgado fired, but Crandall ducked behind a water trough, returning fire in a deafening roar. Thaddeus edged closer, using the barn door as partial cover. "Your men are down, Crandall. It's over," he shouted. In response, Crandall lobbed a bullet that splintered the wood near Thaddeus's head. "Over." "I'm just getting started," he bellowed. The madness in his eyes reminded Harriet of a cornered wolf, desperate and dangerous. Harriet steadied herself and inched closer, circling around behind a dilapidated chicken coop. She aimed her rifle breath, hitching, waiting for the right moment. Crandall, eyes darting, realized he was being flanked. He pivoted, shotgun swinging toward Harriet. Her blood ran cold. She squeezed the trigger. The blast of her rifle echoed just as Crandall fired. Harriet felt a searing heat graze her arm, a burning pain that nearly made her drop her rifle. But her bullet found its mark, striking Crandall in the shoulder. He staggered backward, cursing his shotgun, clattering to the ground. Seeing their leader wounded, the remaining outlaws hastily threw down their arms or fled. Delgado and the posse moved in, rounding up the captives and securing them with rope. Crandall writhed on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder. He glared at Harriet and Thaddeus with unbridled hatred. "You'll never keep me locked up," he spat, face twisted in pain. "I'll buy my way out, just like I always do." Thaddeus limped over, gun drawn. "Not this time, Crandall. We have the ledgers, all of them." He exchanged a look with Harriet, who, despite the blood trickling down her arm, leveled a steady glare at Crandall. Delgado stepped forward, issuing official orders of arrest under the authority of the territorial law. He signaled for Ward, the old Pinkerton agent, to secure Crandall. Ward obliged, binding Crandall's hands tightly behind his back. A tense hush followed, broken only by the groans of wounded men. Harriet sank to her knees, adrenaline evaporating, replaced by exhaustion and pain in her arm. Thaddeus hurried to her side, concern etched into his features. "Let me see," he said, gently, helping her remove the torn sleeve. The shotgun blast had grazed her upper arm. Blood oozed from a ragged furrow, but it appeared no vital area was hit. Harriet winced. "Hurts worse than it looks," she admitted with a tremulous chuckle. Relief flooded Thaddeus. "We'll get you patched up." "You did it, Harriet. You were brave." She looked around at the chaos. The outlaws bound Crandall, cursing the posse, checking their own wounded. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though a dull ache still lingered. "It's over," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks in a mix of pain and triumph. News of the posse's victory traveled fast. When Thaddeus, Harriet, and the others returned to Wilcox with Crandall and his captured men in tow, townsfolk lined the street. Some clapped or cheered, grateful that one of the most notorious gangs in the area had been dismantled. Others stood in hushed awe eyes, fixed on Harriet, the once poor widow who had played a pivotal role in bringing down the criminals. Deputy Delgado and Thaddeus oversaw the booking of the captured gang members. Crandall, spitting venom the entire time, was locked in a sturdy cell at the back of the jailhouse, guarded round the clock, until a judge could be brought in. Among the evidence laid out on the sheriff's desk were Jonas's ledgers, Crandall's own letters and testimonies from the captured men, who, in an effort to save their skins, had begun naming accomplices in other towns. Harriet stood in the corner, her injured arm newly bandaged by Dr. Emerson. A swirl of emotions coursed through her: relief, sorrow for the memory of Jonas, and a fragile sense of hope. It felt unreal that after all this time she might finally be able to live without constant fear. Thaddeus approached, leaning on the desk for support. His own bandage peeked through his shirt, a reminder that he too was still healing. "You all right?" he asked Harriet softly. She managed a small smile. "I think so, Sheriff. Better than I've been in a long while." He nodded, and in that moment, both of them seemed to acknowledge the bond forged between them, through hardship, courage, and trust. 2 days later, a circuit judge arrived to formally charge Crandall. The gallows still stood in the neighboring county seat, and rumor had it that a swift trial would end with a hanging given the weight of the evidence. Crandall blustered and threatened bribes, but the documents Jonas had kept were damning. There would be no easy escape this time. Harriet found herself reflecting on Jonas, on what he might have become had greed not consumed him. She visited the small cemetery behind the wooden church in Wilcox, where she had once thought about burying Jonas, but finances had forced her to lay him to rest near their homestead instead. In a quiet moment, Harriet knelt by a simple marker dedicated to other settlers who had passed. She said a prayer for Jonas's soul, hoping he might find peace in death that he never found in life. Afterward, she walked through the dusty street, noticing how people glanced at her with newfound respect. She was no longer the reclusive widow tarnished by rumors of her husband's crimes. She was Harriet O'Connell, a woman who had helped bring a dangerous gang to justice. At the jailhouse, Thaddeus sat at his desk finishing a piece of paperwork. He looked up as Harriet entered, offering her a faint but genuine smile. "Harriet," he greeted, setting aside the papers. "I was just writing a dispatch to the territorial governor about our success. He might send more rangers to help keep peace." She gave a nod. "That's good news." A pause lingered before she spoke again. "I wanted to thank you. You believed me, and you helped me see that running from this secret wouldn't make it disappear." Thaddeus cleared his throat, emotion flickering in his eyes. "We did this together." The weeks following Crandall's capture brought a strange calm to Wilcox. The once nervous town began to breathe easier. Harriet stayed on, testifying at trial and helping secure the final blow against the Laredo gang. Crandall's sentencing came swiftly. His own ledgers, Harriet's testimony, and the townsfolk's support left no room for mercy. Afterward, Harriet returned briefly to her cabin. It stood quiet and worn dust still clinging to every surface. She and Thaddeus worked together to patch the door, replace broken boards, and gather what little remained. Sitting on the porch one evening, the sunset casting long shadows across the plains, Harriet spoke softly. "I think it's time I moved on," she said. "This land's too hard to farm, and the ghosts here are too loud." Thaddeus nodded. "You've earned a fresh start." She looked at him, heart pounding. "I was thinking of moving into town. Maybe run a boarding house. Folks have offered help." Thaddeus hesitated, something in his expression unreadable. "I think that's a fine idea." 3 months later, Harriet was running a small diner near the new train depot in Wilcox. The town had changed, more visitors, safer streets, and Harriet had changed with it. She no longer walked with fear. Her reputation had grown from that of a reclusive widow to a respected woman of strength. Thaddeus became a regular fixture. He'd stop in most afternoons, always taking the same seat, always with a quiet smile. Their conversations grew warmer, deeper, until one evening he pulled a letter from his coat. "Good news," he said. "The territory's sending more deputies. Seems someone finally listened." Harriet smiled. "That's a start." He shifted nervously. "I've been thinking about stepping down eventually. I've spent most of my life chasing trouble. Maybe it's time to build something instead." She studied him carefully. "What are you saying?" He took her hand across the table. "I'd like to build that life with you, if you'll have me." Her breath caught. "Thaddeus, are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything." Her eyes softened. "Then yes, I'd be honored." From that moment on, the promise of a new chapter began to bloom, not from vengeance or survival, but from trust, healing, and a love forged through fire. The sun was sinking low. When Harriet stepped outside the diner, she now owned the warmth of the evening, matching the gentle flutter in her chest. Thaddeus waited there on the boardwalk, hat in hand, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "Evening, Sheriff," she said with a smile. He chuckled. "Call me Thaddeus. Please." They strolled beneath the moonlight, passing quiet storefronts and shuttered saloons. It had been months since Crandall's downfall. Peace had settled over Wilcox, and with it a quiet hope neither dared name until now. They stopped near the old church where the wind whispered through the rafters. Thaddeus turned to her, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "You saved my life, Harriet," he said. "But more than that, you reminded me there's still something worth believing in. I've spent years chasing justice, but I'd trade all of it for a life by your side." Her breath caught. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything. I may not have riches or land, but if you'll have me, I'd be honored to walk through whatever's left of this world with you." Tears glistened in her eyes. "Yes, Thaddeus. Yes." Their wedding was humble, just friends, flowers, and sun-dappled pews. Delgado served as best man, and Mary Lou stood proudly at Harriet's side. When they exchanged vows, Harriet felt the weight of the past finally lift. She was no longer just the widow of Jonas O'Connell. She was Harriet Mulligan now, strong, whole, and loved. In the years that followed, Harriet's diner grew into a respected inn. Thaddeus eventually hung up his badge, choosing instead to help Harriet run the business. They welcomed travelers and friends alike, their story whispered across the territory as a living legend. Sometimes, when the evening quiet fell over the inn, Harriet would unlock the old trunk, the one that had nearly cost her everything. She didn't do it out of sorrow, but as a reminder of the secrets that almost broke her and the courage that rebuilt her life. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Jonas, not to honor the mistakes of the past, but to redeem the name with love, strength, and hope for a better future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unforgiving frontier, where a wounded sheriff found salvation at the doorstep of a determined widow. They risked everything, facing bullets, unmasking hidden betrayals, and battling their own fears to forge a path toward redemption and love. In the end, Harriet reclaimed her life from the shadows of her husband's secrets, while Thaddeus stood as living proof that justice coupled with compassion can overcome even the darkest foes. If this tale of courage and second chances moved your heart, please show your support by hitting the like button, sharing this story with fellow adventurers, and subscribing for more dramatic narratives from the dusty trails of the Wild West and beyond. Your engagement helps us continue spinning epic yarns of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. Until next time, stay safe and ride true.